Oklahoma City has since reauthorized the same style of tax 3 times, most recently passing with 72% of the vote, which I don't know what you could get to pass with 72% of the vote these days. And so I think that shows like a testament to how popular this program was. And from a statistical perspective, they've been able to attract billions of dollars of private investment. Their economy is growing year over year. Their population is growing. So everything is headed in the right direction. And when we were there, we saw this vibrant city. We saw young families. We got to tour some of the projects that they had done. And when we came back, we said, this is amazing. We are so primed to do something similar.
Welcome to the East Anchorage Book Club. I'm your host, Andrew Gray. The purpose of this podcast is to tell the stories of Alaskans of interest and importance. Today, our guest is Jenna Wright, President and CEO of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. AEDC exists for 3 reasons: to encourage economic growth and diversity in Anchorage, to promote a favorable business climate, and to raise Anchorage residents' standard of living. The corporation is funded through private contributions, municipal and state grants, and contracts. Jenna took over AEDC last year from recent mayoral candidate Bill Popp, who had been the president for the previous 16 years. We discuss Choose Anchorage, which is a research project looking at 4 different areas that Anchorage needs to improve in to make our municipality more attractive to business. We also talk about Project Anchorage, which was mentioned at the top of the show. This is an AEDC proposal to institute a 3% sales tax in Anchorage, 2% of which would go to relieve our property tax burden, 1% would go to fund new capital projects that would make Anchorage a more amazing place to live. Jenna Wright, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Andrew.
Let's find out a little bit about you. Where'd you grow up?
I am a born and raised Anchorage citizen. I grew up on South Side. I went to Bayshore Elementary, and then I was homeschooled from 2nd to 7th grade, went to Mears Middle School, and then Diamond High School. And then I did all of my university schooling at the University of Alaska Anchorage. So I am very much homegrown Anchorage resident.
What did you study there?
I got my undergrad in investment finance and marketing. I was dual enrolled. And then I went back in 2015 and got my MBA with an emphasis in business intelligence and data analytics.
Oh, had you always seen yourself as headed in that direction, or is business analytics your passion since childhood?
I would not say it's my passion since childhood. I found myself a little bit bored in high school, and it was difficult for me, I think, to stay engaged. I was really fortunate to have been introduced to the dual enrollment program that they had in the senior year of high school, where you can go to UAA and get your final high school credits as well. So I did that. And at the time, I always knew like I was drawn to business. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. And so I took a few classes and realized that I really loved numbers. And so I went down the investment finance route, and I saw myself being an investment advisor, making it rich on Wall Street or something like that. And when I got out of college, I went and worked as a financial analyst, and I like the numbers portion of it, but I could not do it 100% of the time. I was really drawn to the bigger picture. And so when a role of director of business operations came up at the company that I was working for, I put my hat in the ring for that role and loved it. So that's my evolution.
And filling this in a little bit from when you finished your MBA till taking over AEDC, what did you do in that period?
Great question. So I got my MBA in 2015, and I was working at Microcom, which is a local satellite communications company with operations in Alaska and Hawaii. And I was the director of business operations, as I mentioned. From there, I went over to the state of Alaska and ran the statewide DMVs for about 4 years under the role of deputy director and acting director. Part of what I loved working at the state was having a positive impact on Alaskans' lives. And we brought a lot of modernizations and improvements to the department to be able to do that. And I was really proud of that. But I was looking for something that was a little bit more local. And I didn't really want to get into politics or go work for the city or anything like that. So when I saw the vice president role at AEDC pop up, I was really excited because I felt like it was a perfect marriage of my skills and my interest, which is to make a positive impact in the city that I was born and raised in, and I'm now raising my family and love so much. And so that's the evolution.
Do you mind if I ask how old you are?
I have to think about it. 34.
34. I didn't run for office until I was 47.
Yeah. People are not very nice to politicians. Good on you guys for being able to do really important work.
I think that the negative aspects of being a politician are greatly exaggerated.
Yeah.
I think the positive far outweighs negative. I just put that out there because I want good people to run for office.
Yeah. I'm so glad to hear that that is your perspective.
Yeah, no, this is it's all fun. You are currently the president and CEO
of the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation. That's right.
They took over basically a year ago.
I did. I worked under my predecessor for about a year. And then when
Your predecessor was?
Bill Popp, he ran the organization for 16 years, and he left last fall to go run for Anchorage mayor. And during that time, I threw my hat in the ring to be selected as his successor, and that was made official in September of last year.
So for folks who may not know exactly what the AEDC is or does, just give us a brief little description.
Sure. So we were formed back in the 80s, 1987, as a municipal entity to help pull the city out of a recession that was occurring after a drop in oil prices. 2 years later, we were spun off to be a private nonprofit in 1989, and we've operated under a 501c6 membership-based model, very similar to the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce, for instance. And we've been operating that way ever since. So depending on what's going on in the economy, we pivot our approach. Right now, we're doing a lot of focus on talent attraction so that we can attract business as well, because it's difficult to attract business if there's not the talent to run their operations. And so we do a lot of work around placemaking and making it so Anchorage is a place that's worth choosing. And that's a little play on our strategic plan, which is called Choose Anchorage.
You took over a year ago, and I guess talk us through what that experience has been like and where you guys are today.
The experience has been amazing, and it feels like we've gone through so much change in the last couple of years. You know, when I came on board, we were finally starting to get our head above water in terms of the economy after the pandemic, and it allowed us to look at the overall landscape of the Anchorage economy and say, where can we be the most effective? And I came on board at a time where we were doing a significant research project that my predecessor had initiated. We applied for an Economic Development Administration grant to allow us to do an in-depth economic research of all of Anchorage. We hired a economic consulting firm that used both quantitative analysis of all of the data, of course, but then they also really took a qualitative approach and spoke with business leaders. They held a bunch of industry-specific roundtables, which allowed them to gather up a ton of data and create what we are now using as our strategic plan, which is called Choose Anchorage. And basically what the researchers found, which wasn't new to us at the time, but the public at large wasn't talking about it as much of an issue, was that we are losing our working age adults in Anchorage. And that's a significant problem for the economy, because in order to grow the economy, you need people to work in jobs, and you need to be able to have the talent if you want to attract businesses to Anchorage. And so anyways, I came on board when that research was being done, and then I was able to help deploy that final product. And the Choose Anchorage plan has 4 different areas of focus. One is business vitality. The second is talent. The third is quality of place. And then the fourth is infrastructure. And so I was able to take this plan and go through it. It's very comprehensive. It's not something that we can do alone as an organization, but I was able to think about how we can activate the rest of the community to start working on some of these initiatives. And then what were some things that we were really well positioned to take over at AEDC? I've got a staff of 4. And so our workforce development program manager, for instance, really leaned into the academies model that ASD is working on. It just recently was passed by the school board, and they'll be implementing it this coming fall. And so she worked on really designing that and now implementing it as an example project.
Can you explain what the academy model is?
Yes, the Academies model is a proven model in other areas of the U.S. And from what I understand, the board goals for the school district are college, career, and life ready. And they went across the country looking for different models that they could bring to Anchorage that would achieve those board goals. And what they found was this Academies model that is deployed in Akron, Ohio, Nashville, Tennessee, and a couple of other places in the U.S. And basically what they're doing is they're infusing career education into high schools. So think about it where you've got your main language arts, math, those types of classes, science, things like that. But you're also going to be taking a career exploration class in your freshman year. You're going to see what you're interested in. You're going to choose an academy for your 10th, 11th, and 12th grade year where you're taking classes that are specific to, let's say, healthcare or transportation or public policy, all of these things that are important to the Anchorage economy. And as part of that academy's track that you're going through 10th through 12th grade, you are getting access and you're being introduced to employers, whether that's through employers coming into the classroom or if you're going out into job shadowing scenarios, different maybe day in the life of a aviation mechanic or something like that, just for an example. And so it's really giving these students context to be able to understand this is the type of work that I'm doing at school, and this is what I'm learning, and this is how I can apply it to a career in the future. And I'm super excited about it because I think we can use it as a retention tool, because now all of a sudden they've been introduced to employers, they can see a path to a career in Anchorage, and we can stop some of the bleed that we're experiencing with our young, talented Alaskans.
2 questions about that. Number 1, did ASD come up with the academy plan and present it to you guys, and you guys said, we support this, we feel this is really good? Or were you involved in the actual discussion of moving towards an academy model?
So ASD is the one that found the Academy's model. It's being supported by Ford Next Generation Learning, which is the nonprofit arm of the Ford Motor Company. And they came to us early on to ask what our thoughts were on whether or not we can get the Anchorage business community activated and involved in this initiative. Because if there's not business community connection, it's not going to be a viable product. And so they came to us early on and we said, absolutely, this is just school business partnership on steroids. This is going to be great for our community. And ever since that point, we just tried to support them in any way that we could. We pushed it out through our network and partnered with the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce and United Way and University of Alaska Anchorage to really design the program and help them out with that.
My second question, as a legislator who's had the academy plan presented to them a few times, I've heard that one of the hopes of the academy model is that folks who pick a particular career track will be more grouped together, smaller classes, get to know each other more, that there'll be more sense of community. And what we've seen in Alaska education over the past years, as we've lost teachers, I love the idea of smaller classroom sizes. However, if you have a certain number of students and less teachers, there's just no mathematical way to make your class sizes smaller, which to me means that we really need to be making sure that we're not losing teachers, that we're actually attracting more teachers so that we can really properly roll out this plan. It means that we need to properly fund our schools so that we can roll out this new plan and have it succeed.
I would agree with that statement. So would the AEDC Board of Directors. We actually did take a position on this during the last session. We recognize that we need to fund our public education system as a talent retention tool, if nothing less. It's very important. We're losing 1 in 3 kids right now. And if, like I was talking about earlier, if there's a better pipeline from schools into the employment community, that's going to be a great retention tool. So we took a position on that last year. We wrote a letter to the governor as well as all the Anchorage-based legislators and really asked for an increase in school funding. We're not experts on what that number is, and we referenced that, but we know that we needed a more stable and permanent increase to the base student allocation.
So back to just talking about Choose Anchorage and that study. Was there anything in that study that you guys funded that was like a surprise, like something learned from interviewing business owners, things that you weren't expecting to hear?
At the time, we didn't realize how much the decline in working age adult population was really having on employers throughout. It was really when it first started to rear its head that, this is a problem. And it's continuing to get more and more difficult as we have the baby boom generation retiring, and they didn't have enough kids to backfill that workforce. And then on top of that, Anchorage and Alaska are struggling with net outmigration. So it's like compounding factors that are making it so it's more and more difficult for Anchorage-based employers to find employees to run their operations the way that they're doing right now, but as well as expand. We went over the Business Confidence Index survey results at my biannual luncheon yesterday, and 44% of employers want to increase their employees, but they're just not quite sure where they're going to find those workers in all cases.
And you have an infrastructure pillar.
That's right. Yeah. So a few of the primary goals within the infrastructure pillar are that, yes, we need to maintain our infrastructure. We also need to look at different multimodal infrastructure models, stuff like that's fun for different communities like bike lanes and walkability and pedestrian access. All of those things are very important to us.
Do you support the pilot program of the bike lane on 6th and...
Yeah. One of the goals within Choose Anchorage is to get more biking lanes within Anchorage. I support the pilot. I don't know that the way that particular lane is set up is the perfect combination, but I love that we're trying it out and we're getting data that will help us to make more informed decisions for a more permanent model, for sure.
And then what's the 4th pillar that I'm forgetting?
You're forgetting quality of place.
Quality of place.
Yeah.
Tell us, what is quality of place and how do we improve it?
Quality of place is all about livability and loving the city that you live in. So this can be things as little as city beautification, right? Flowers are beautiful and we should have those downtown, which we do,
yes.
Right? Murals are so much fun to look at and really make a city vibrant. And we're really big fans of ACDA's Great Street Facade Improvement Loan Program, where they're getting murals all the way from C Street to downtown. So cool. Other things within livability are activating spaces. So we've got the Downtown Partnership, who's doing music in Town Square, Bracevich Park. We just did a great block party outside of Snow City, which was a joint Visit Anchorage and Downtown Partnership event. So doing things like that, make it so it's a fun, vibrant city that you love to live in. That said, it also needs to be a safe city, right? And so it talks about the fact that we need to solve the homelessness issue in Anchorage. That's a problem that we're having. It also talks about just different livability issues that make it so we love this place. And one thing that's livability related that falls in the infrastructure pillar is having a public investment strategy into new capital improvement projects that make it so it's exciting to live in a place and there's fun things going on right now. And so I'm sure we're going to talk about at some point, but that's Project Anchorage.
So Project Anchorage, my understanding, you can correct me or add to it. This is a proposal to introduce a 3% sales tax to Anchorage, 2% of which would go to property tax relief.
That's right.
And 1% would go towards these capital projects that you just mentioned.
Correct. In a nutshell.
In a nutshell.
Yes.
So I guess flesh that out a little bit more.
Sure. Take us back to the beginning a little bit. Before my time at AEDC, there was an initial delegation that went to Oklahoma City. We did a second trip in 2022. The International Economic Development Council's annual conference was being held in Oklahoma City. And so we took advantage of that conference and brought 20 Anchorage-based business leaders to see what they had done with the MAPS program, which stands for Metropolitan Area Projects. And this was something back in the 90s, their economy was struggling, oil prices had collapsed, a subsequent banking system failure was affecting their economy. And they said, what are we going to do? All of our young people are leaving, the families are leaving, and they decided to invest in themselves. And they implemented a 1% sales tax. It was temporary. And they went out to the community of Oklahoma City and said, what are some fun projects that you would want to see for the community? The community submitted ideas. There was a way to compile all of these ideas. And essentially they took, I can't remember if it was 6 or 8, some amount of projects, put it on their ballot and said, this 1% temporary sales tax is going to fund these specific projects. The first one was just a 5-year tax. And they, at the end of the 5 years, said, all right, we did it. Were you happy with it? Do you want to do it again? And so Oklahoma City has since reauthorized this same style of tax 3 times, most recently passing with 72% of the vote, which I don't know what you could get to pass with 72% of the vote these days. And so I think that shows like a testament to how popular this program was. And from a statistical perspective, they've been able to attract billions of dollars of private investment. Their economy is growing year over year. Their population is growing. So everything is headed in the right direction. And when we were there, we saw this vibrant city. We saw young families. We got to tour some of the projects that they had done. And when we came back, we said, this is amazing. We are so primed to do something similar. We actually did do something similar back in the 80s when we built the Sullivan Arena, the Lusac Library, the Coastal Trail, the Egan Center, the museum, like all of these gems that we still love today. But we've not done something like that since Project 80s.
So speaking of the 80s and building those large infrastructure projects, one of the criticisms is that we had lots of extra money at the time. The oil was booming. What are we going to do with all this money? Let's build these enormous structures. There wasn't a good plan for how we would maintain and operate that infrastructure decades later when we didn't have tons of extra oil money. And so I think that's a drawback, is if you build infrastructure, how are you going to keep it operational, and how are you going to fund the operations once we don't have that money anymore?
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's so important to keep that in mind, because it would be irresponsible to just spend all of the money building a structure that we have no way to maintain. The Sullivan Arena is something that we've been struggling with for a number of years now, and it's a good example of what you're talking about. And so right now, back in June 11th, we launched a portal. It's projectanchorage.com. And the idea is we're trying to solicit ideas from all over the community. And what we're going to do is when the portal closes on September 15th, we're going to take all of these ideas, try to pull out some that we feel like are a good blend of being exciting, new capital projects that would attract private investment, but also have a solid way to maintain and operate the facilities. And one idea that's percolating to the top as we're having community conversations, because we launched this in June 11th, and now it's like, all right, let's talk about this. What's the best way to do this? And one of the ideas that's coming up that I think satisfies your concern there is that we have a lot of aging structures that need maintenance, but could also be modernized in their use. For example, the Kincaid facility. That could be something that could be totally transformed while simultaneously upgrading the building that we're using there.
I think humans in general get really excited about something completely new.
Totally.
Refurbishing or repairing an existing structure doesn't create the same sort of excitement. But I think making things awesome that we already have should be something that we keep in mind. I attended the Assembly's housing conference last year, and one of their guest speakers pointed out that instead of investing, $1 billion in new water and sewer to go to a community that hasn't been built yet, we could invest that, and I'm just made up the number $1 billion, in the oldest parts of our water and sewer, which are leaking and failing and causing huge issues, and ultimately making a part of the city not desirable. No one wants to be there. And so it ends up being the quote unquote bad part of town.
Sure.
If we poured that investment in making the quote unquote bad part of town the best part of town, that might be a better plan for Anchorage as a whole than building something awesome that's like outside the city center. I don't know.
Yeah. And there's not been really any ideas to build something outside the city center. Actually, the contrary. We want there to be something that's accessible for everyone. So all the way from Eagle River to Girdwood. We want there to be a project in Girdwood. What in Eagle River? We don't want just one big project downtown or one big project in Midtown. We want there to be projects sprinkled throughout Anchorage. And so all neighborhoods benefit from it. And,
Roger that.
you
Yeah.
know,
They were thinking about housing and like building a new subdivision somewhere, like to increase the supply of housing.
yeah, or the bridge. Is that kind of what you're thinking when you say $1 billion to run infrastructure?
Yes. Yeah. Do you guys have an opinion on the bridge?
We've not taken a position on the Kununkarn Bridge, no.
I think that is the perfect example of where it would be a lot of money that might be better spent fixing what we have than building some sort of paradise for people to flee from the unmaintained part of the city that we have.
The other thing, too, is that we see time and time again that private investment will follow public investment. And so if we do invest in a neighborhood and we build a new facility, all of a sudden that's bringing up the overall look and feel of that neighborhood. There's an excitement now because you can walk to this facility, whether it be a park or a community center or whatever it is that the community comes up with. And now all of a sudden you have private investment that's going to the surrounding community and just bringing up the entire neighborhood. And so we definitely are keeping those virtuous circles in mind, and that's the intent.
The property tax relief, I'd like to pivot and talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
Something that I learned, I interviewed Lisa Parker, who was on the Anchorage Charter Commission in 1975. She was the youngest elected official in Alaska at the time she was elected, but she was 19. The past 14 to 16 years, I guess, she's been on city council in Soldotna. And when I asked what's the biggest difference, she said, Soldotna has an extraordinarily low property tax burden because we have a sales tax that supports the city. And that was really something that kind of clicked in my head is, okay, so other parts of Alaska are doing this differently. Low property taxes because they have another source of revenue. I think one of the things that has made it difficult to do a sales tax in Anchorage is actually the charter itself, which has a Bill of Rights, which protects people from a sales tax. I'm not a lawyer. My understanding is that there's actually been some legal cases that show that really we just need 50% plus one to pass this. We don't have to have 60% as the charter says we do. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but I guess the point is we've never had this sales tax in Anchorage. We have basically funded our city government with property taxes. So I guess talk a little bit about your motivation to reduce the property tax burden and why you think the sales tax is the best way to do that.
Sure. And just quick correction, we have had a sales tax in Anchorage, from what I understand. It was a very long time ago. So we've not had one for a very long time. One of the reasons that we liked the sales tax was that we have a huge tourism industry in Anchorage. And so by having a sales tax, everybody pays for it, even those that don't live here. So not only is it the millions of visitors that are coming into our city every single year, but it's also those that commute into our city, thousands of people on a daily basis. We did some research to help inform this proposal and found that conservatively 20% of the total tax would be paid for by people that don't live in Anchorage. And so that was one big motivating factor for us. The other thing is we look across Anchorage, and one of our major issues right now is affordable housing. We can't change the cost of supplies. We can't rapidly change the supply of housing. There's a lot of things that we can't change, but one thing that we can do is change the amount of property tax that gets taken out of a monthly mortgage payment. And so that was really our motivation, was to capture visitor spending and make housing more affordable by reducing the property tax element of it. And so the way that the proposal is set up right now is that for an average home of about $450,000, which was the average when we did this research, now it's a little bit higher, it would be about $100 off a monthly mortgage payment because you would reduce the property tax liability by about 20%.
So I'm looking at page 1 of the Project Anchorage
Great.
PDF that you could print off online. And it's talking about some of the major findings from the study that kind of informed what you did. And I won't talk about the second bullet point. It says to reduce the burden on low and middle income household, exempt categories would include rental housing. I had never really thought of rental housing as something that would pay a sales tax. Is that something that happens in other cities? Do you pay sales tax on your rent?
It's not common, but you do have to exempt it and make sure that's called out. There are best practices on sales taxes, which we looked at in other communities across Anchorage, as well as the rest of the lower 48. There's different resources from sales tax foundations and things like that we looked at. And so it's just something that's important to call out, that we would not want to tax rent.
Roger. And I guess as a representative who has a lot of apartments in my district, I think a lot about renters. And so it was a surprise for me that there would ever have even been a consideration that somebody might have to pay a sales tax on their rent.
Yeah, I don't think it's common.
But I would say if you are an owner of an apartment complex and that property is worth a couple of $1 million, then you seek to get major property tax relief from this proposal. And I'm just assuming they're probably, and right now that burden has been passed on to the renters. Rent in my district has gone up over 30%, in some cases as much as 50% in the past 5 years.
Right.
Massive increase in rent. We're particularly going to put in place this property tax relief, which will relieve the owner. But my guess is probably those people's rents will not go down because it's just very rare for rents to go down. For me and my constituents, if there was a way to incentivize or somehow call out that a rent decrease would be warranted.
Yes, we have had conversations about this, and it was also very important to the coalition that put this proposal together, that rental homes weren't disproportionately affected when you institute a sales tax, when they weren't necessarily going to get an immediate benefit from rental relief. I think in our conversations, we recognize that it will probably be rare that a landlord will say, great, I have this immediate benefit.
Your rent's going down by $100 a month.
Your rent's going down by a proportionate amount. I don't think that's realistic to happen. However, what I do think is realistic to happen is that over time, rents aren't going to continue to rise at the exponential rate that they have been rising, because now there's a break for them on the property tax side and they don't need to continue to raise rents at the same level.
In the same bullet point, it also points out that there will be a sales tax exemption for purchase amounts over $1,000. And keeping my lens on my lower and middle income folks, let's say their major recreational expense for their family is bicycles. Most folks can afford to buy a bicycle less than $1,000. You can go to Target or Walmart and there are bicycles that are at a price point that are less than that. So that's their major recreational expense for their family, are these bicycles that will pay the sales tax. Whereas you've got your upper income folks that might purchase a boat, which is well beyond that $1,000 price cap. Why should the rich people buying boats not pay the sales tax, whereas the lower middle income people should be paying the sales tax on their bikes?
I don't think it's necessarily just rich people that buy boats. As I'm thinking back to an example, as we were having these discussions, somebody brought up to me, a lot of folks from rural Alaska will come into Anchorage and need to buy a snow machine or a four-wheeler, was the example, but a boat can fall into that category as well.
But snow machine's perfect, right? Pivot to snow machine.
To do subsistence hunting, right, or get transportation throughout different villages or places that they live in Alaska. And so we didn't want to affect those folks that were coming in to purchase those very necessary but expensive items. And then on the flip side too, we didn't want to severely impact consumer spending to the point that it negatively affected businesses in Anchorage either. Because now all of a sudden, when you have higher priced items, let's say a car, for instance, now all of a sudden you're playing the game of, okay, can I go to Soldotna or Matsu and purchase a car there instead?
Save 3%.
And save that 3%. Exactly. And so we didn't want that to be a part of the equation and to affect overall spending throughout Anchorage.
Maybe there's a way to state that large purchase items purchased for the purpose of subsistence in remote Alaska would be exempt. Maybe there's a way to exempt automobiles because that I can see that. Like, definitely lower income folks probably need a vehicle. And so exempting that. But when I think about some large recreational purposes, such as boats. I hear you. There are some lower income folks who have to purchase a boat, but in my experience, most folks who own boats are upper income.
One other thing I'll say on this topic is that we are not experts in all things public policy and tax policy across the city. This proposal is going to the Anchorage Assembly.
Right. So they have an opportunity to tweak it.
That's absolutely right. This is our high-level recommendation from our business coalition. The Assembly is going to take a look at this. They're going to talk to their constituents. They're going to go through the public process. And likely the final product will look different than this. This is just our current recommendation. And so it's not the final.
Right.
There's plenty of space to have these conversations and try to get down in the weeds and find those nuances like you're talking about. But those are things that are better, I believe, to happen at the Assembly level.
Because our city government is completely funded by property taxes. And when you are reliant on one stream over time, it gets high. So I want to be clear. I'm not opposed to this plan. I just want to make sure that it's not a plan that mainly benefits upper income folks. I want to make sure that lower income folks are benefiting as much, if not more, than upper income folks. So that's just like where my lens is.
I totally agree. And that was also really important to our coalition as well. And that's why we spent quite a bit of time debating the exemptions and making sure that we were taking out basic household necessities that lower income folks are spending more or a larger percentage of their income on. We tried to take all of those out. And I will say too, we're in the process right now of evaluating our proposal against some consumer spending data with ICER, because we want to validate that we're not having a negative impact on lower income while we are only positively impacting higher income folks. That was never the intention, right? The intention is to get visitor spending, capture some of that, and to make housing more affordable. One other point is that 2/3 of households in Anchorage own property, and those aren't just rich people. And so that's something that's important to keep in mind. The Center for Economic Development are the ones that did the original proposal, and throughout our conversations with them, they said property taxes can also be regressive. And so we're trying to, through our research with ICER, we're trying to validate that statement to say, okay, what is the current model with property taxes on families at different income deciles? And then what would this new proposal look like with sales taxes and a reduced amount of property taxes on those same households? So we really are trying to do our research to make sure that this is the right thing for all of Anchorage. Again, focusing on housing affordability, capturing visitor spending. And then we've gotten away from the 1% for capital improvement projects, but also just making Anchorage a better place to live where we all love to be here and are optimistic about our future.
Exactly where I want to go. So about the capital projects and using that 1% for capital projects, how will those projects be decided upon? And because currently right now we put bonds on the ballot. If bonds are approved, that's why it's difficult to say what is the mill rate, which is like how we compute the property taxes. Is that it's variable, because if all of the bonds get approved, then additional revenue will be required. So everyone will pay a little bit more property taxes next year. Whereas if the bonds fail, then we would not have those additional expenses. So the property tax rate might be slightly lower. Would we continue to do the same bonds? And would these 1% projects be completely different projects? Or can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. This proposal would operate completely outside of the bonding process. It would be, so it's a 3% proposed sales tax. 2/3 of it for the property tax relief would be under the cap in an exchange. So instead of coming from property taxes, it comes from sales taxes. There's no new revenue going into the municipality. The other 1/3 for the capital improvement projects would be above the current tax cap, and it would be dedicated for the specific projects that are going to be on the ballot. That money, it's our recommendation that it accumulates, and we don't break ground on these projects until we have enough money to finish them. So in other words, there's no debt and there's no cost to service that debt. And so that's very different than the bonding process, right? Where there is a cost to service that debt. And they're separate. I think we would still continue with bonds for other things. For instance, infrastructure bonds, road bonds, school bonds, potentially park bonds. That's something that's really popular for Anchorage, but we might also wrap some park projects into Project Anchorage. It just depends. And then in terms of how the projects would be selected, I think that was your second question. Right now, we're trying to get as many ideas as we can from the community of Anchorage. As a coalition, we don't think we have the best ideas by any means. We think that the best ideas are going to come from Anchorage residents. So we're going to compile all of those projects. We're going to go back out to the public, try to get some polling data on which ones are more popular. And then we would pass our recommendations, almost like a menu, to the Anchorage Assembly with our data and let them know this is the research that we've done, this is the feedback that we've gotten from the public, and these are our recommendations. And then they would go through their process to say which ones work for different districts and how we can have an equitable distribution throughout the municipality. Ultimately, they would choose the final projects that would then be on the ballot for the voters' consideration in April.
Okay. I may have misheard that last part. The 1% capital projects would go to the ballot, or no, would be decided by the Assembly?
Both. So the Assembly would choose the projects that would go to the ballot in April, and then voters would vote on that ballot initiative.
Okay. And if for whatever reason it got 49%, it failed, what would happen with that money? Would it just sit there?
We would never collect it. It's one ballot initiative where voters would vote as one combination of 2/3 property tax relief and 1%.
Projects are listed.
That's right. The projects are listed on the ballot initiative.
Okay. And this is for 5 years? Is that the idea?
That's not been decided yet. That was what Oklahoma City did. Their first maps was for 5 years. And so we've been sharing that information out. But ultimately, that's a decision that the Assembly would come up with. And it also depends on which projects we end up wanting to go with. So
if it's a 5-year project. So I guess I'm getting a little bit better understanding. If we decided this was going to be a 5-year sales tax, then those projects that we would list would be listed up front. And that 1% would be going to fund those projects over the next 5 years.
We would collect the tax for 5 years. So, well, for example, if 5 years was the number, which I'm not saying that it is, that would give us an estimated $300 million budget. And so we know how many projects that we can fit into that budget. And we wouldn't start building the projects until we have enough revenue collected to finish that project. And then we move on to the next one and move on to the next one. So we would collect for a specified amount of time, but that doesn't necessarily mean the projects would be finished in 5 years or 6 years or whatever the time period is. It just means that's how long we would collect the revenue to be able to do the projects. And so that informs our budget.
Gotcha. This is a political question, and it may not be one that you want to answer, but it is something that I think about in terms of capital projects. We had a capital budget this year. We had a number of projects in East Anchorage and my part of town, which is the lower income part of town. And many of them were vetoed down to zero by the governor. Could we use this 1% to fund those projects that are essential to East Anchorage that have been vetoed to zero? One example was a new drainage project for the football field at Betty Davis East Anchorage High. This is $500,000. Would the Assembly decide, hey, we're going to make sure that those projects happen no matter what? Or how does AEDC think about those sorts of considerations?
So to answer your question, yes, this can be used to fund whatever Anchorage residents want it to fund. A drainage project isn't, I guess, necessarily the vision. We were thinking more capital improvement, quality of life, exciting projects, which a drainage isn't as much.
What makes it difficult for track and field, for lots of things to happen there. So it's not an exciting project.
Right.
We particularly tried to pick something that we thought was not super expensive, but necessary. You know what I'm saying? Like we're always making a political calculation. What's something that we think will just be like, yeah, that needs to happen. Not exciting, but needs to happen. Yeah. So I guess, but actually that's actually important information. So I guess what would be a better example if you're like, we're not really looking to fund a drainage project. Like we need to put in a new basketball floor or something. I have a long list of things there.
Okay, so we're on the sports side of things. One example of a project that's been submitted is like an East Side Dome. So we've got the dome that's over there off of Minnesota. Yeah, so something like that, a sports facility with all kinds of different fields in there, soccer fields, track fields, pickleball fields. It's a great place for kids, especially to stay active in the winter time. And we're very much a winter city. So that would be an example of a project that would fit in this criteria of quality of life, capital improvement type of projects. If there needed to be infrastructure upgrades to be able to build a facility like that, we would build that into the project as well.
Cool. Anything else that you wanted to add that we haven't really covered about Project Anchorage? Because I wanted to pivot away for our last couple of minutes.
The last thing that I'll say on Project Anchorage is even set aside the issue of the sales tax, whether or not your listeners support a sales tax, please submit project ideas because we want to make sure that the final project list that comes up is representative of what Anchorage residents want all over this city. And we want to make this place even better. I love this city. I've lived here my entire life and I'm not sheltered. I've traveled to 20 countries all over the world. I love traveling, but I'll always come home to Anchorage because I love it so much. And I want my daughter and all of our children to have that same experience growing up in Anchorage. And I think we need a fresh coat of paint to be able to do that. And that's what Project Anchorage is.
Hey, one last question. Speaking of 5 years or 3 years or whatever ultimately goes to the ballot, would the assumption be that after that time period, things would go back to the way they are now and we would go back to the higher property tax when this period is complete?
It would be temporary. Yep, the whole 3%. So yes, it would go back unless voters decided to reauthorize it. It would be up to the voters.
Okay, cool. I wanted to finish by talking about just a little bit more fun stuff. So you have a daughter.
I do.
How old?
She's 5 months and a week.
Wow. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And you are born and raised Anchorage.
Yep.
Your husband is the descendant of Walter Harper, who was the first person to ascend Denali in 1915.
1913.
1913.
Yeah.
Wow. So y'all have some serious roots.
We really do. And I'm so proud of this story. And I think it's so cool that we actually named our daughter Riley Harper after Walter Harper. But in 1913, Walter and a group of climbers, they went up Denali and summited for the first time. And then 100 years later, in 2013, descendants of each of the original climbers embarked on a centennial climb to commemorate that original summit. And my husband was one of those climbers.
Oh, that's so awesome. So your husband climbed.
He climbed Denali in 2013. And it's actually how we met because we connected on the story of the centennial climb. And I said, hey, I think this is so cool what you're doing. My dad's climbed Denali. He's attempted it 3 times and summited twice. And so we connected over mountain climbing and we went on a dog walk to talk about mountain climbing and the rest is history.
Wow. And do you have a desire to climb Denali?
Not now that I'm a mom. I did when I was younger and I love mountain running. That's really been my passion, I would say, over the last 6 or 7 years. And when I was younger, I really did want to climb Denali for not only the family aspect of it. I thought it would have been really cool if my brother and my dad and I did it all together. But now that I'm a mom, my risk tolerance has changed so much and I'm no longer interested in that. Thanks for asking, though.
Cool. And I guess to finish up, if folks want to learn more about AEDC, if they want to learn more about Project Anchorage, what should they do?
To learn more about AEDC, go to aedcweb.com. All of our staff is listed there, and you can see what we're all working on, and you can learn a lot more about the Choose Anchorage plan overall. And then if you want to learn more about Project Anchorage, go to projectanchorage.com, where you can submit feedback, you can ask questions, and then more importantly, you can submit project ideas, which is our big focus right now.
Is there a particular project that you've seen that you're most excited about or were most surprised by or
I get asked this pretty frequently, and I'm not being coy when I said I've not paid a ton of attention to the projects yet. I'm more talking about just the overall concept and trying to get people excited to submit the projects. So we're not to the stage of evaluating things yet, and so we're not paying a ton of attention. But I mentioned there's an idea for an East Side dome. There's quite a few projects in there about what we could do with Town Square or the Park Strip. There's a group working on a very cool Four Seasons facility out at Kincaid that really leans into us being a winter facility and capitalizing on our...
Like a Four Seasons hotel?
No, like a Four Seasons facility.
Because that would be like pretty epic.
The Kincaid Four Seasons?
Yes.
I don't know. Go ahead. Submit the project idea. No, like more like you can rent bikes in the summer. You can rent cross-country skis in the winter.
Gotcha.
Four seasons of weather.
Okay, cool. Hey, Jenna Wright, thank you so much for being on the podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me.
All the links mentioned in this podcast today are available in the show notes. Thank you, listeners. If you like what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review us. To contact me, email rep.andrew.gray@akleg.gov or call my office at 907-269-0123.